Hello and welcome to the program Head to Head. I'm Olis Gerjuk with UATV. Ukraine has been known as the breadbasket of Europe, exporting its grains worldwide. Ukrainian food exports to the European market has grown particularly since the country signed the EU Association Agreement. What is the potential for further food productions and food safety technologies in Ukraine? To discuss this, we are joined in the studio today by Volodymyr Lapa, head of the State Food Safety and Consumer Protection Service of Ukraine. Hello, Volodymyr, and thank you for being with us today.
Hello.
So, first of all, from your professional experience and the position you hold, how would you evaluate the quality of Ukrainian food products in terms of safety?
If you're talking about quality and safety, it's more or less good. Of course, we have problem, but any country in the world, I would say, have problem from time to time. But Ukrainian products, if you're talking about grains, well known in the world market, and we export our grains to almost 100 countries about the globe. Of course, a little bit different picture with livestock production, but even in this sector, we have possibilities to export to many markets, including market of European Union, and that means that Ukrainian system of safety recognized by our trade partners.
Mm-hmm. But on the world scale, what place does Ukraine take in terms of food safety again?
There is no ranking like general ranking of food safety.
Okay, but what is the potential of Ukraine to become a good exporter?
Any country in the world has its own system of safety, and there is no good, no bad system because each country has its own specific. But I would say that our ranking is like moderate level, not well-known, not high quality, high safety product. But if you're talking about comparison of price and quality and safety, we have very good position in the world market.
What and how many protocols on regulation of food safety are functioning in Ukraine?
Well, it's very complicated legislation, starting from primary legislation. I mean, it's competence of Ukrainian Parliament, Verkhovna Rada. We adopted a few legislative acts which approximated to legislation of European Union. First of all, it's law on food quality and safety, which adopted in 2014. Last year, in May, Ukrainian Parliament adopted law on state control, and in December on feed hygiene. And we are in the process of approximation of legislation. I would say that if we compare our legislation with European Union, we approximated legislation at the level of roughly 40%. We have to do it in the future. We have a governmental strategy of approximation.
What is the strategy about? What is lacking?
It's like a specific plan which regulates and directive of European Union we should approximate and in which time.
Mm-hmm. What about international standards in Ukrainian food industry?
Each country has its specific requirements. So, of course, there is like general requirements, standards of Codex Alimentarius in food safety, but each country has its own specific requirements. And, for example, when we export our production to European Union, we should satisfy requirements of European Union.
Of course.
If you're talking about China, that's Chinese requirements.
Let's talk about European Union.
That's more or less the same in general, but there could be specific topics with in different countries.
Mm-hmm. But let's talk about European Union. Ukraine, 2 years ago, the free trade agreement between Ukraine and European Union came into force. How did it change the situation? How did it influence the food industry in Ukraine?
First of all, I told about specific of export, especially if you're talking about export of livestock commodities. We should satisfy to requirements of imported country. We conduct and agree a form of veterinary certificates. Sometimes, especially if you're talking about European Union, we should conduct few checking procedures. European inspectors visited Ukraine and checking system of Ukrainian state control and production. And only in case if they will show that Ukraine can implement European legislation in practice, some facilities can export such production to European Union. In fact, if we're talking about very specific issues, for example, residuals of different chemicals or antibiotics in livestock production, there is specific regulations of European Union, and we are at the stage of discussion with Ministry of Health, and I expect that during this year such specific provision of European legislation will be implemented in Ukraine. It's a process.
But now, are there some hazardous substances still used by Ukrainian farmers that are forbidden in the European Union?
There could be only minor issues, because in general regulation more or less the same, but there could be different level of residuals in Ukraine and in European Union. I would say that we have comparatively good system, and we should adopt legislation just more precisely.
Mm-hmm. What about the quality of the products? How much does it differ between the products produced in Ukraine for Ukrainian consumers and products produced for export?
If you're talking about export, I told that we should check facilities, enterprises according to legislation of imported country, and of course there could be some difference. I would not say that it's big difference. As I said, we have system of control and we have our own legislation. Sometimes it's former Soviet legislation, sometimes a new regulation which adopted during previous 20 years. But I would not say that we have big changes in requirements. And in any case, if you're talking about, for example, about facilities which can export livestock production to European market, that's more than 100 Ukrainian enterprises. And of course, if they sell their production to European market, they sell the same production to Ukrainian market. And each year we have increasing of number of such facilities, and that means that each year, especially taking into account approximation process, Ukrainian consumers will have more and more the same products as European consumers.
Mm-hmm. So the quality will grow and will match the European quality of
Definitely.
The products as well. Okay, but what products do we export the most and where?
If you're talking about grains, that's almost all countries which import grains in the world market. Specific markets or key target market for Ukrainian grains, it's South Europe, North Africa, Middle East, and East-South Asia. If you're talking about livestock products, markets more or less the same. We have access to European market for such kind of products as dairy products, poultry products, honey. We also export our livestock production to African market, to some African markets, again Middle East and South Asia. But it's a process because we opened a lot of markets, but Ukrainian business requests more and more markets.
Speaking about honey, some of Ukrainian farmers complain that the tax-free quota for export to the European Union is not high enough. How does the state react to that?
If you're talking about access to the market, we have two lines of regulation. First line, that's SPS issue, that's like veterinary requirements or food safety requirements, and also a tariff issue. And especially if you're talking about European market, they have comparatively high import tariffs and not such easy to access to the market with such high tariffs.
That's why there is still some quota for.
That's why such import quotas important for Ukrainian producers. But for such specific commodity as honey, we can compete at European market even with tariffs. So Ukrainian honey producers fulfill the level of quota during few days in January, and then they export our production even with tariffs to European market.
What about the quotas for other products?
That's a matter of competition, and during negotiation it was very hard process because European Union has quite influential farmers lobby. That's why in free trade agreements we have so-called tariff quotas for many agricultural products. That's grains, that's dairy products, poultry, honey, and a number of other commodities. So in almost in all cases where was concerns from European farmers, European Commission put quota as a key requirements for signing of FTA.
But still, in general, what's your opinion? How competitive is Ukraine on international food market?
We are competitive. That's not only vision, that's fact.
Because Poland also, neighboring Poland, is very highly competitive in the European Union because basically it produces almost everything. What about Ukrainian goods? How popular
Just
are
one
they?
example, when one of Ukrainian facilities receive Euro number, that means that possibilities to export eggs to European market, Polish farmers was very concerned because they feel competition from Ukrainian producers. So we are competitive at European market, but you are told that Ukraine historically defined as a bread basket. And often people talking about bread basket of Europe. I would say that that's not the case in current time because European Union is net exporter for majority of agricultural commodities, and that means that we of course can export to European market, and that's very important not only in respect to value, to volume, but mostly in respect to recognition. If you can export to European market, that means that you could have simplified access to other market. But in fact, if you're talking about key markets, probably it's not European Union, it's again Middle East, so that's African countries and South Asian countries.
Mm-hmm. If the Ukrainian producer has an access to European or Asian market, how does it influence the price on in the domestic market?
That's competition, and of course, as much you can export, as much competition, and that's the reason to have a little bit higher prices
here in Ukraine.
Here in Ukraine, but it's world market. We had the opposite scenario. For example, after starting of war with Russia, we lost Russian market, and historically, Ukraine exported 70–80% of dairy products to Russian market, and there was huge decrease in of prices at Ukrainian market, and that means that such
decrease of prices.
Decrease. If you're talking about situation, for example, 3 years ago,
but
access to market provide market prices to Ukrainian producers.
Well, I remember Natalia Mikolska, Deputy Minister of Trade and Economic Development, was saying that in 2016, Russia was still among top 5 the biggest trade partners of Ukraine. What about the results of 2017? Did the situation change, and do we still keep the trade with Russia on the same level?
That's more about general statistic. Of course, we are independent from Russian market for many commodities like energy products. But if you're talking about agricultural products, such dependence is not such higher now. We have limitation according to governmental ban, the number of commodities banned from Russian Federation to Ukraine, I mean import banned, and the same situation if you're talking about export of Ukrainian commodities to Russian market. And of course we have veterinary requirements, for example, Russian territory is not healthy for many animal diseases, and that means that in addition to official limitation for export, we have also our own episodic limitation.
So there is no trade in food
no
industry?
No big trade, I would say.
Okay, no big trade. Coming back to our topic about food safety and the quality of food, which categories of products in Ukraine tend to improving their quality lately, and which ones are which ones are the most dangerous, so to say?
I would not rank in the specific commodities, because that's a question about system. We are in the process of approximation legislation, and ideally we should have the same system when each producer should comply with legislation which will be adopted to European legislation. If we're talking about experience of Eastern European countries, such way took about, as a minimum, 5-7 years of transitional period. So that's not only about legislative requirements, that's also about possibilities for competent authorities to fulfill such requirements at the level of state control, and especially about possibilities of business. They should invest money in improvement of technology.
But what legislative regulations are lacking here in Ukraine still? What procedures should be implemented?
For example, according to European legislation for high-risk commodities, such as raw meat, the frequency of checks should be one time per 3 months or one time per half of year, because it's high-risk commodities, it's high-risk facilities. According to previous Ukrainian legislation, we had possibilities to check facilities not often than one time per 2 years.
And, one time per 2 years.
And last year, as I said, Верховна Rada adopted law on state control, and we put European principles, I mean we as a country, Верховна Rada put European principles to Ukrainian legislation, but that's not only about frequency, that's about implementation of risk-based control. So the frequency of checks should depend on type of commodity, type of your activity, and results of historical checks. And then each facilities will have its own frequency of checks. We are the process, and the majority of key issue of European legislation adopted in Ukraine, but many specific issues we should adopt in the future. And if we will go back to the governmental strategy, the final date of approximation mentioned as 2021. Probably there will be some kind of transitional period, but till 2021, legislation should be adopted to European one.
Also, recently the government presented the roadmap of reforms to be implemented within the next 2 years, and among the initiatives there is a bill that would require all the food producers to list every ingredient. And how does it function now in Ukraine?
We have requirements, but it's not very strong. We are talking probably about draft of law on information for consumers.
Yes.
It was in Верховна Rada, but Parliament sent it back to Agricultural Committee for additional work. And we are at the stage of communication with business community and with Agricultural Committee. Probably within a few weeks we will have a new or adopted edition of this draft of law, and we hope that Верховна Rada will be able to adopt this law during this year. If you're talking about specific requirements, you as a consumer can see the labeling of food products, and sometimes even for myself, I have quite good eyes, but I cannot read the specific ingredients with this small
size of the letters.
Small size of the letters, and there is quite simple but specific requirements. Consumer should know what he will buy.
Should be able to read that.
Should be able, and should be able to conduct a real choice with understanding of quality products and price. Then it will be real choice. And that's what we are talking about, specific requirements of European legislation. That's not about changing of all the systems. That's very specific requirements which provide for consumers additional guarantee.
Well, let's hope that these requirements will come into force very, very soon. And unfortunately, that's all we have time for. But thank you so much for this interesting conversation.
Thank you very much.
That was Volodymyr Lapa, head of the State Food Safety and Consumer Protection Service of Ukraine. Thank you for watching UATV.